This presentation is being recorded for EdTech 566, a course offered at Penn State University. The theme of the course is Computers as Learning Tools, and one of the main organizers for the course is a book by David Jonasson called Modeling with Technology. And in order to understand how to use computers as learning tools, we need to have a clear understanding of learning theories, because the theories are going to guide what we do with the technology. So the presentation is going to be in several parts. This first part is to develop a model, a mental model for human information processing, and then we want to use that model to understand and interpret learning tasks. And then we're going to move into building a mental model for schema development, which is a way of thinking about how we organize our long-term memories. And schema development is going to be key for developing learning experiences that fit into structured knowledge situations. Now, the reason I say structured knowledge situations is that we have several learning theories. We have behavioral learning theories, which is the old stimulus response type of a learning theory. The most classical is, the classical conditioning. And then into Skinner's learning theories, where you use reinforcers to shape student learning. We have information processing theories, which are theories that are based on the idea that humans have an information processing system, and that we can think about that information processing system and identify different parts of that processing system, and then use that understanding to build our understanding, or actually to predict how we should design learning experiences. There are social cognitive theories, which are theories that explain how we learn by example and how we learn from social contexts. And social cultural is Vygotsky's theory, which is the underpinnings of most of the modern constructivist learning theories, or the constructivist approaches to learning. In our particular situation, many of the students in EdTech 566 work in K-12 environments, and many more work as instructional designers where there is specific structured knowledge that needs to be developed. And my view is that the information processing theories are the most useful for building, for using as a framework for building learning activities to address objectives in structured knowledge environments. So for this particular part of the activity, we want to work on developing a basic understanding of the human information processing system. And we want to work on developing a mental model for that information processing system, and then use this mental model to contextualize the information processing as our main learning theory in the course. Then we want to be able to use the information processing model to interpret mental events, and that way we will be able to predict practical implications of using this type of a mental model. Again, I want to mention this idea of mental models because it's going to be an overarching theme of the entire course. Okay, so what we're going to do is graphically, in a diagram, talk about developing a representation of our memory system. And this particular model that we're going to develop is based on a textbook by Ellen Gagne, Carol Yekovich, and Frank Yekovich. And I'll often refer to this just as Gagne, or Ellen Gagne, because she was the author of the first edition of this text. And what we're going to do is we're going to develop a representation for the information processing system that's based on a model that's presented in that text. Now the text itself is about a little bit over 20 years old, but I think that the particular approach that they take to explaining what is rather well-established knowledge in the learning theory world is very appropriate and applicable to our needs for EdTech 566, which is why I choose to use this rather old textbook as a basis for our learning theory. The theories that we're going to be using are established, but the explanations provided in this text are much better for our purposes than information provided in some of the newer texts that I've been able to find. So that's the reason that we're going to stick with the Alan Gagne representation of this. Before we start, I want you to just take a minute and go ahead and memorize that number sequence. And I'm going to ask you to repeat that number sequence a little bit later, but I don't want to give you too much time to memorize that number sequence, so that's all you're going to get right there. All right. Now, the approach that we're going to take to this particular model development is going to be an intuitive approach. In other words, what I want to try to do is present this model in a way that makes intuitive sense. Based on some of the earlier psychological theories were based on introspection. This model, when we talk about it, should make sense in terms of when you look at it and you think about how you think and learn, the different parts of it should make sense. So what we're going to do is talk about this model, and as it develops, we're going to actually be developing the model that's presented in the Alan Gagne text. But we're going to put our own emphases into the model so that when we're done, we're going to have a model that's more elaborated than the model that's in the text. It's going to address some of the things that we're going to think about during EdTech 566 in using computers to develop and support learning. So we want to start with a model. If we think about a model, this model has to have a place for us to do thinking. And I mean, it's the place where our conscious thought is going on right now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to call that our working memory. So working memory is the place where you're thinking right now. And what we want to do is think about what happens because we have a working memory. One of the things that we can do because we can think is we can generate responses. So we think about things. I'm thinking about what I'm talking about right now, and the responses that I'm generating are the products of what I'm thinking. So that's the initial piece of the model. We think, we act. Okay, but the next question becomes, what do we think with? So we can be thinking with information that we get from our surroundings. And information from the surroundings can include sounds, sights, and sensations. And you think about sounds, sights, and sensations, you listen, you see, and you notice. But I think probably the easiest way to think about this is how many times do you not notice somebody talking? You know, if you're concentrating really well, you can focus out the external sounds that are around you, or even think about sensations. And the example I like to use is Think about your feet. And do you feel your feet, whatever they're doing right now? If your feet are inside of shoes, do you actually feel your feet inside of your shoes? Or is that information that's simply not noticed? And what has to happen if we're going to have a model that's going to explain all this stuff? We have to have some sort of a piece in this model that's going to have to help us account for these different things. So we have these external places where information can enter into our information processing system, but we have to account for the fact that it doesn't get in there until it gets noticed. Okay, so we're going to add to this model a thing that we're going to call the immediate memory. Now, depending on the learning theories that you've been exposed to in the past, this immediate memory, you may recognize it as sensory register. Okay, the sensory register is the place where the information coming in actually gets noticed. And if it gets noticed, then the information gets admitted into working memory. So I'm only thinking about my feet when I notice my feet. So then I can get that information into my working memory, and I can sit here and think about my feet, and I can think about wiggling my toes or whatever. However, we want to have in this model a place to account for how this immediate memory behaves. So what we need to do is add another area to our representation of memory, or our memory model, and we're going to call these control processes. So the control processes are going to actually, in one case, receive input from the environment, from the immediate memory, and then help to control the immediate memory for our selective perception. So one thing that control processes do is interact with this immediate memory, and some of the control, some of the things that are built into these control processes are instinctive. Okay, these are things that we just know how to do automatically. We're born with these abilities. For example, if a bee lands on my neck and stings my neck, I'm going to slap my neck. I'm going to go after that right away. I'm not going to have to think about that. That's going to be an immediate response from my control process, and that's actually going to go directly out as a response. So in terms of immediate memory, the control processes determine what we notice for admission into working memory. And they can be set to passive mode, where we don't actually need to be paying attention to it, and our attention can be diverted by the environment. But the control processes can also be set to actively seek information from the environment depending on the task. So if we are scanning, say, a diagram, maybe this diagram in particular, if I wanted to help to support your control processes and support this particular part of it, I might insert something with a bright color or bold fonts or highlighted backgrounds that would actually draw your attention to a particular part of the presentation or the diagram. So control processes can actually be set by expectancies, and so they can be used to activate the appropriate parts of the control process. So we have information coming from the outside, we have a place for that information to get captured, and then depending on whether or not we need it, it will be admitted into working memory. So the next thing that we want to think about then is what happens if it's not admitted to working memory. It's lost. So we don't continue to hold information that we don't need. It's just immediate memory is a place for a quick image, and if you don't use that quick image quickly decays away, and it's just out of the information processing system. So right now we have a model that we're developing, and I want to remind you it doesn't actually describe real processes in the brain, but it's actually a representation of different processes that have been observed. And in our case, we're trying to develop this as an intuitive model. So now let's go back. Remember at the beginning, earlier part of this presentation, I asked you to remember a five-digit sequence. What was it? Now, if you didn't use any type of an encoding strategy to memorize those 5 digits, you probably weren't successful. And that was why I tried not to give you too much time to actually remember the digits, because I didn't want you to use any strategies. I mean, you could, if you look at these digits and you can think, well, 5 and 3 is 8. So I got a 5 and a 3, so I can have 50 minus 3 is 47. I mean, something like that. If you had enough time to think about that, when I ask you to remember this 5-digit sequence, you might remember it. But chances are you didn't. And the reason that you didn't is that you can't keep information in working memory unless it's actively being used. So even if you were able to remember that 5-digit sequence, and if I asked you 10 seconds later, what's that 5-digit sequence, you can repeat it back to me, or you could use that 5-digit sequence if you were reading it from a data sheet and entering it into your computer. Unless you are actively using that information, it can't stay in working memory. Okay, working memory can only work with information that's active in working memory. So in terms of this model, that's something to keep in mind. And it's a very important piece, okay, that working memory has its limits. It's not something that you can permanently encode information into. A common misconception that I hear from students is that working memory is this place where you can actually store information. Working memory is not a storage area, it's a thinking area. And you can only think with information that's there, and if you're not actively using it, it's gone. So if you want to remember it, you're going to need to do something else with it to store it so that you can bring it back into working memory later. Now, something else I want to think about with working memory, that's our active area of thinking, is another limitation, and I want to demonstrate this limitation with a different memorization activity. Okay, so here's 2 lines of numbers now, and I'll give you a second to try to memorize those 2 lines of numbers. Okay, now I'll have a little screen here where you can pretend you're listening to quiz show music or thinking about what you memorized, and also think about it while I talked. I don't know if you were able to impose some sort of a pattern of recognizable numbers to those 2 lines of numbers, or if you just have super memorization powers, but see if you can reproduce those 2 lines of numbers now. Okay, were you successful? And again, I would suspect not, and I would suspect not for 2 reasons. One is that I actually distracted your attention, after I asked you to memorize the numbers, I gave you something to read and I talked. And if you listened to me, you had to use up part of your working memory to listen to me or to read this line. And if you're using up part of your working memory resources for some other task, you have less working memory resources left to remember those two numbers. So I'm going to guess, number one, that you had trouble memorizing those numbers because there were too many of them. And number two, that because I distracted you, you probably had trouble memorizing them. Now, if you were really exceptional or had some strategy that helped you memorize those numbers quickly, if I would add a third line of numbers and ask you to repeat this exercise, my confidence that you would fail increases. Now, the point of this part of the exercise is to demonstrate that there are limits to how much information you can manage at one time in working memory. So trying to memorize 2 lines of 5-digit numbers is much harder than trying to memorize 1 line, even if you're given time to rehearse it. And if I would add a third line of 5-digit numbers, the task probably would overwhelm you. Another way to think about the limits of working memory is just to do a simple mental math problem. So if I would represent this particular math problem in a traditional way, you would say, okay, I would like you to subtract 44 from 97. It would look like that. Now, what I want to do is ask you to look at the problem this way, and I want you to visually and in your mind try to take 97 and visually subtract 44 from 97 and see if you can manage to do that with just images in your head. The images in your head are you actually manipulating this information in your working memory. So if you were successful at doing that, you got 53. Okay, I'm going to give you a new problem now, and I want to ask you to do the same thing. We're going to visually work this problem out without actually looking at the numbers. So here's the new problem, to subtract 36 from 74. So I'm going to give you the word representation of that problem and ask you to visually do this problem. Now this problem is a little more difficult to manipulate because we have to actually borrow and make this 14 minus 6 and 6 minus 3 to get the answer. You may have been successful at that, but this problem should definitely have been more challenging for you than the original problem. And one of the things that you might have noticed is maybe you closed your eyes to help you to think about that problem. And what happens when you close your eyes? You end up blocking off one of your senses and eliminating information from your immediate memory, the sensory register, to just keep that from impinging on the information that you're trying to manipulate in your working memory. Now, if you were able to complete that problem, if we just add another level of complexity and ask you to do that problem mentally, you might eventually fail. So the point here is that we've established, hopefully intuitively, that working memory can only hold information if it's working with it, and if not, the information's lost. And the other thing that we're trying to establish intuitively is that working memory has a limited capacity. We can't actually manipulate that much information in our working memories. And there's been research on our working memory capacity, and depending on who you read, there are some evidence, some interpretations that say we can only hold 5 chunks. The more commonly cited figure is 7 plus or minus 2 that was established by John Miller in 1956. So this kind of research into the nature of working memory, you can see, is 60, 70 years old now, and it's rather well established. But it's a very important piece of information for us to understand, because if we present a learning task at a rate that exceeds the capacity of working memory to process it, we just can't perform the task. So we need to recognize that working memory has limits, and we need to design our instructional strategies to be aware of that. And we can also, in this course, think about how we can aid or supplement working memory. So that's going to be an important thing for us to think about. And we're going to use the term cognitive load to talk about the demands that are placed on working memory during a learning task. One of the things that might interest some of you is that there's some evidence that special needs students aren't able to learn as well because the capacity of their working memory isn't as large. So there's some evidence to suggest that capacity of working memory determines our ability to work with complex information, and therefore could be related to intelligence. Now, to review then, okay, we have information admitted to working memory from immediate memory. Now, we haven't really talked about long-term memory yet. Information in working memory is lost if it's not being used. So we use rehearsal processes to retain information in working memory. So that's like if you look up a phone number, and then between the time you've looked it up and you run over to dial the phone, you may have repeated that number to yourself. That's called rehearsal. Hopefully we've intuitively established that there's a limit to how much information we can hold in working memory, and the most frequently cited number for that is 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. So we can conclude that working memory is really a bottleneck for our ability to do complex thinking. So we know that we have achieved complex thinking. Since we're not capable of doing that in working memory alone, we need to look at how we manage to accomplish this thing. And output from working memory can go to the environment, but the other thing that we want to establish here is that information, if you get too much information coming into working memory, or if there's too much time elapsed and you're not able to rehearse that information in working memory, it's lost. Okay, it falls out of the information processing system so that it's no longer available to us. So here's what our model looks like right now. And the question becomes, well, if we can't hold all this information in working memory, then how do we account for our ability to think? Well, we need to add another component to our information processing system, and we're going to call this next component long-term memory. And what can happen, and I alluded to this earlier when I gave you the five number sequence and asked you to memorize it. If you were able to quickly develop a strategy to take that 5-digit number and make it more meaningful, what you were actually doing was you were able to take that information that was in your memory and pass it over to your long-term memory. And what was able to happen then is when I asked you to retrieve it later, you were able to bring it back from long-term memory into your working memory. You weren't holding that information in working memory the entire time. Now, the process for getting information from working memory over to long-term memory is called encoding. So the example that I used, and in fact, just talking about that example, I said the number was 85047. I was not able to remember that 5-digit sequence, but when I explained to you the strategy that you might have imposed on that 8 is 5 plus 3, that helped me to think that the next two digits were 50 and the next two digits were 50 minus 3. I'm able to recall 85047. That's an example of encoding. So when I recall that 85047 now, I'm not recalling that from working memory. It can't stay in working memory that long. What's happened is I've managed to impose some rules onto that information and put it somewhere so that when I wanted it, I'm able to retrieve it. Okay, so that process of putting information into another storage space where it can stay and then bring it back later when you need it is called encoding and recall. And the place where we keep that information we're going to call long-term memory. So long-term memory is a place where we can store information. It's also a place where we can store experiences. So that's called episodic memory. And now episodic memory is memory of events. Like if you think about something that you did an hour ago, you might be able to recall that in sequence. Now part of that would actually be because you probably have imposed some meaning on it and you could deduce some of that from prior experiences. But some of it's just pure episodic memory, which is just memory for events as they happened. And unless those events are very, very powerful, they're not going to stay with you for a long time. Whereas learning is information that we hope is going to stay with you forever. And so what we want to do is understand how we encode information in long-term memory so that it will be available to us later when we want to recall it. Now, another thing about working memory is that it responds to situations. Okay, so when you're in a situation, many times you know how to behave in that situation. All right, or the situation sets for you expectations or expectancies on how you should interact or how you should behave in that information or in that situation, or how you should seek information from that situation. And what happens is those expectancies, or what you notice about the context of the situation, can work on another set of control processes, and the control processes can help to determine what kinds of information you will seek from the information. So, I mean, if you're actively looking for information in a diagram, the fact that you're looking for information in a diagram activates control processes that determines how you admit information from immediate memory. So that's something else to think about in terms of getting information into working memory. We can get information into working memory from long-term memory, which is, you know, information that's relevant that we want to recall in order to experience or think about information that we're getting from these new experiences. Well, we need to account for some of that. Probably a term that would you've heard in the past would be metacognition, which is how you think about your thinking. And there are actually learning strategies that you unconsciously employ when you're seeking out certain types of information or when you're trying to learn something that can be part of your control processes for admitting information into working memory. Another good old favorite, this falls into professional development. You may have heard of Robert Gagne's Events of Instruction, or just Madeline Hunter's. I don't know specifically. I don't recall specifically how she the name of her system, but it falls into teacher professional development and probably basic rules of creating any presentation. One of the first things you do at the top of a presentation is present the objectives. And the reason that you present the objectives is to activate certain control processes that will help to direct your attention to the most appropriate information coming into the presentation. Now, I don't know if you recall what my objectives were listed for this presentation, but they were rather general, not so much to get specifics, but to develop an overall mental model, a representation for an information processing system, be able to use that information processing system to understand learning events and make predictions about learning events. So my objective is pretty broad. So in terms of focusing your attention on any specific piece, not so much. But you can employ certain types of attention getting devices or certain situations where you can facilitate the learning by setting the environmental conditions, which then help to activate the appropriate control processes for learning. I hear teachers tell me about establishing routines for their students so that you get your students into a certain routine and they're more receptive to learning when they're in the routine. And that's because you're helping to establish which control processes they're going to use for admitting information into long-term or into working memory. And eliminating distractions, that sort of thing, will help you to be more productive as a learner. Now, we have to account for something else. When we do a search of long-term memory, we try to recall information. So if I ask you to recall the capital of Pennsylvania, if you live in Pennsylvania, that'll be very easy. You'll just say Harrisburg. That kind of a search of long-term memory is pretty direct, and it returns one chunk of information back to working memory. So, the search there is pretty easy. The information isn't that complex. But we have to have ways of thinking about more and more complicated information. And we have two things that help us to do that. One is the development of schemas. And schemas are going to be a big organizing principle for us because schemas actually control thinking about more complicated information. It's a way of mentally grouping information and assigning value in terms of organizing it and using big ideas to think about little ideas. A second thing, though, is if you were in an algebra class, say, and I give you an equation and ask you to simplify that equation, chances are that you're going to go about the task of simplifying the equation without actually having to think about the individual steps. So like if you're factoring out a common number, you may divide each term of the equation by that number without even thinking about it. And you're just like doing it. If you're a chemistry student and I ask you to balance an equation, you might just do it and not have to really think about it at all. There needs to be a process, a place in an information processing system to account for that. And what we're going to use is procedural knowledge to account for knowledge that executes automatically. So as we work on developing an information processing theory, what we're going to need to do is add a place or a function that's going to help us develop knowledge that executes automatically, procedural knowledge. Now, once what we're going to call that process proceduralization, and again, the Gagne book, the Alan Gagne book, has chapters on proceduralization. If you are teaching in an area where it's important to develop procedural knowledge, then it's important for you to understand procedural knowledge and proceduralization as a process. And again, you'll have opportunities to do that if it's relevant to you. What ends up happening is that information that's in long-term memory can be proceduralized. And the interesting thing about procedural knowledge is once it exists, it can be executed without even thinking about it. So if I want to factor an equation, if I want to solve an equation for x, I want to balance an equation, or do many other mental processes. I mean, reading is proceduralized knowledge. Okay, if you teach language, thinking in another language is developing proceduralized knowledge. Grammar is proceduralized knowledge. So we do a lot with proceduralized knowledge, and once it exists, once we're able to develop it, procedural knowledge can be recalled directly into working memory and be used without even having to think about it. You think about the implications of that. Since working memory is limited to 7 plus or minus 2 bits, having the ability to think about a bunch of relationships without actually having to think about the components of those relationships gives us the ability to think more complexly. Okay, that's how we manage to think with complicated information. We think about complicated information, number one, because we can create schemas which create groups of information. An example is you could have a schema for fruit. Okay, if I say fruit, you're able to think about an entire collection of information with just one idea, fruit. Okay, so you can bring fruit into working memory, and then you can dissect fruit as you need. That allows working memory to piece things together. But the other piece is you can think about a whole sequence of steps without having to think about the sequence of steps if it's been proceduralized. So even though working memory is limited, if you're able to create schemas and if you're able to create procedural knowledge, you're able to use the combination of those two to think with complicated information. So that's something that we need to account for in this model. Another thing that we want to make sure we account for is the fact that procedural knowledge can work with declarative knowledge to make more complicated procedural knowledge. So this entire process actually can go on and on to build more complicated procedural knowledge, but that actually has to take place in working memory. So the circuit would look more like this involving working memory, because an important thing to remember that I haven't mentioned yet is that working memory is actually the place where information gets encoded into long-term memory. It has to be the encoding has to happen in working memory. So you have to think about information, you have to do something with it in order to get it encoded into long-term memory. And that's one of the things that we're going to be focused on in this course, is how we use technology to actually support this process of encoding information into long-term memory. Another point is that procedural knowledge also helps to build these control processes. So when we're talking about using control processes that affect learning, and we're talking about conditional knowledge or metacognition, that doesn't just happen. Okay, that's knowledge that has to be proceduralized, because if you have metacognition for something, you don't necessarily actively think about your approach to that information. You have developed those approaches with successful experiences, and those successful experiences came from conscious thought about the needs for that learning experience, and that would develop declarative knowledge about those conditions and the successes, which in turn can be proceduralized. And it's I put it up here just to separate it out as a process that actually affects how you pay attention to information or how you attend to information. So it's a different kind of information that feeds into working memory than the procedural knowledge that I was describing before with balancing equations. They're both procedural knowledge, but I give them separate paths just to indicate that they're a little bit different in terms of how they serve the information processing system. Okay, something else about procedural knowledge. I said that it executes automatically. Procedural knowledge can actually generate responses directly also. So your information processing system, procedural knowledge can be automatically executed. The easiest example of that is driving. Okay, if you're driving down the highway, you're basically operating on procedural knowledge. Your information processing system is taking all of the conditions, and that information is just going right into procedural knowledge and coming back down to your response generator and having you control the car. An interesting thing to think about is, I know this happens to me, if I'm driving along in a leisurely pace, I'm not really having to pay attention to my driving, because the driving process is putting so little demands on my working memory that it's just passing right through to my response system. So if I'm driving along in a situation like that, and all of a sudden I come into a hazardous condition, the thing that comes to mind most vividly for me is I'm driving along and it's snowing, and all of a sudden you come around a turn and you see red lights everywhere, and it tells you that something really bad has happened up ahead. If I'm listening to the radio or something like that, one of the first things I do, and I do this instinctually, is I turn the radio down. And the interpretation for that would be that I have instinctually, which is actually procedural knowledge that I have developed over time, know that I need to free up my working memory to attend to the inputs from the situation at hand, a dangerous situation. So my information processing system makes me respond in a way where I tune out some of the extraneous information that I don't want to come into my information processing. And all of a sudden I'm going from, relying completely on procedural knowledge to taking and giving higher priority to the input that's coming from my immediate memory to work with my procedural knowledge to control my driving. Okay, one last thing I didn't mention earlier, and I didn't think of it until I had made all of these slides, was that one other thing that I should have included in long-term memory was the idea of images. Okay, so I said long-term memory can contain episodic memory. It can contain declarative knowledge, which is knowledge of information, schemas, which are ways of organizing information. One other thing is that we can retain images in long-term memory. And there's some debate about if those images are actually, how they're actually stored. But in terms of this model that represents an information processing system for us and helps us to organize our thinking about an information processing system, the idea of keeping images as a way of storing information in long-term memory is going to be very useful to us. So, this is an information processing model based on Gagne, Yekovic, and Yekovich, and this should help us to account for most of the learning processes that we need to think about and understand as we think about how to use technology to improve learning. So we're going to try to think about technology as an operator on this information processing system, either working on the working memory, developing long-term memory, or procedural knowledge. So with that, we'll stop, and that will be the end of part one of this presentation.